Well, I'm re-recording this because I somehow forgot to save it. I'm recording it as I'm driving, and I've had the opportunity today to go into the office and pick up some stuff, which I'm sure, like many of you, given the current situation, you haven't actually left your house all that much. If you have a white-collar job that you can do from home, you probably have done it from home. So it was interesting to get out of the house and go back to the office and see at least a couple people I knew, although they made us do it by appointment so they could keep the numbers down. One thing that I like about this style of recording while I'm driving is it puts a natural limit on my ability to ramble and repeat myself and go on and on and on for way too long, because as I get closer to my destination, I know I need to wrap it up. So I'm talking today again about my favorite type of video game, the type of video game that's, swung back into my full favor, but it always kind of was. It just hadn't been playing any of them for a little while. And these are the 2D martial arts fighting games. Street Fighter 2, of course, excuse me. Street Fighter 2, of course, is the prototype for this type of game. Street Fighter 2 arguably invented the entire concept of fighting games as we know them and established the conventions that pretty much every fighting game since has copied, or if they've not copied, then they've reacted specifically against. So Street Fighter 2 is really kind of the granddaddy of all of this, although Street Fighter 2, of course, has as its prototype Street Fighter 1, which I will call it that, and if I just say just Street Fighter, I'm referring to the franchise overall. Street Fighter has a number of subseries within it. There's the Street Fighter 2 games, the Alpha games, the 3 games, the 4 games, and the 5 games. And then, of course, there were a number of spin-offs using the same or slightly modified game engines, like the Marvel games, the Marvel Versus, the SNK Versus, Darkstalkers. And then, of course, there were a lot of rivals that were built to imitate Street Fighter. Some of these have some longevity and are still around, like King of Fighters in particular. And then there was the long-running rival Fatal Fury. Others are now much more forgotten, like Fighter's History or Breaker's series. And then there were other types of fighting games too. Mortal Kombat was one that was built on a significantly different aesthetic, even though the game itself wasn't necessarily super different in its gameplay. Then the 3D games based on polygon modeling came out, like Virtua Fighter and Tekken and Soul Edge, which was later called Soul Calibur. For the console ports. And so I was a fan of all of these, but my favorite are the ones that are the more Street Fighter-esque, the ones that kind of have an animated look to them, like an animated movie, cartoon-like or comic book-like. They have superheroes, basically, even though they don't wear spandex and have secret identities, like Captain America or Spider-Man. They obviously have, full-blown superpowers and exhibit them frequently in their matches. And I like the 2D playing field. I like with the, up and down, the jumping and the crouching and stuff like that. There's other ways of creating fighting games, obviously, but those are the ones that I like the best. And I even kind of like the bright and polite visual style of them, and as opposed to being super grim and gritty or something. You could say, to use a more modern pop culture reference, it's the difference between the DC universe and the Marvel universe. I kind of prefer the style of the Marvel universe, and I think that the Street Fighter games in particular, and even games like Darkstalker, which was specifically meant to be based on horror movies, is still kind of the same bright and polite style. It's animated, it's lively, it's colorful. It's not grim and gritty. Mortal Kombat is grim and gritty, although it's also so over the top that there's kind of a wink, in-joke kind of quality to it. The creators are kind of joking with the audience a little bit, and the audience is in on the joke. So it's very dark and edgy, but it's also not very serious, and it doesn't play itself straight. It plays itself as if it's kind of a joke for the most part. Not entirely, and it varies from Mortal Kombat title to title and character to character. But the Street Fighter type games are the ones that I really like the best. And I'm going to go through many of these titles in depth and do a video where I focus on a title or a subseries of a title maybe, or something like that. But before I do, I want to kind of record this to establish some context. What type of stuff do I like and why do I like it? What type of gamer am I? So that when I pick my favorites and I talk about why they're my favorites, there will be a lot of people who will disagree, and for various reasons. And, to be honest with you, if you disagree, you're wrong. But that's okay. It's within your rights to be wrong, and I don't care if you're wrong. You can be wrong all you want, as long as you don't, try to troll me and tell me how you think that I'm wrong, because I don't really care. So I consider myself a serious fan, but not a serious gamer, if that makes sense. I'm a serious fan in the sense that I have been a fan of Street Fighter since 1987, when the first one came out. And I remember seeing it, back in the day. I'm part of the arcade generation, right? I was born in the early 70s. Arcades were a fixture of my childhood, middle school, and even a bit of my high school years, although the business model of the arcade was starting to fade by then. And I remember seeing arcades almost everywhere. They had them in every single mall you ever went to. They had them in lots of other places. They had buildings that were dedicated solely to being video game arcades. I remember when every convenience store, 7-Eleven, grocery store, Kroger's, they all had at least a couple of arcade cabinets, or maybe a little ante-room with a few arcade games in it. I mean, I remember when that was what we did. And I remember, in fact, specifically seeing Street Fighter, the first Street Fighter, in a number of different arcades. It was in one of the malls in my town, and it was in the entrance foyer to Walmart, of all places. So I played it there, and I was a fan already. A number of years later, in the early to mid 90s, when the internet was finally a thing, and I was a college student, one of the first things that I did, of course, was look up Street Fighter stuff. And Street Fighter was, it had been around for a year or two already by now, Street Fighter 2, but it was still kind of going strong. And I remember very clearly when Super Street Fighter 2 hit the arcades for the first day, and there were, huge crowds standing around for several weeks watching people play, figuring out what changes had been made to characters we already knew, figuring out what was going on with these new characters like Cammy and DJ and, et cetera, et cetera. And, this is back in the day of Usenet, so I remember looking stuff up on Usenet, and not that I necessarily participated in, but I spectated in a lot of conversations about it. So I've been a serious fan for a long time, where I've been involved, I guess. And I like these games. I've bought a number of them for a number of consoles over the years, and I'm not like a super serious collector. I don't have any arcade cabinets in my house. I don't have any super obscure, gaming systems that I bought specifically so I could have a specific port of a specific game. I'm not that kind of collector, but I've got a lot of games on a lot of systems, and I have had a lot of games on a lot of systems over the years. Even when I was a poor grad student with a young family, I had something, and I often kind of went back and got games that were a little bit older after they were cheaper. So, and I was a late adopter of a lot of things. I got a PS1 when the PS2 was already out. I got a PS2 when the PS3 was already out, kind of thing, right? And then I would go get games that were usually used, but those are the games that I had always wanted to have, and they were usually this type of game, and I've got a lot of them. And I don't necessarily play a lot of them anymore, but I can. I mean, I can get down my old PS2, which is kind of the system that has most of the titles on it, and set it up whenever I want. It's just a little bit of a hassle, so I don't do it very often. So I've been a huge fan for a long time, but I'm not a serious player. I'm not competitive. I don't play against other players all that often. Every once in a while I would get together with some of my friends when we were in college. Every once in a while I'd play with my kids when they were younger. And I'd play with my brother-in-law every once in a while, stuff like that. But I'm not serious about it, and I'm not really into the competitive scene. I know that a lot of people, there is kind of a competitive scene. There are actual professional Street Fighter players, for crying out loud. And some of them have truly amazing skills of precise timing and tactics. And you can look up a YouTube video of the Daigo parry, for example, and see a perfect example of this. But that's not the type of play style that I don't play that way, and I don't enjoy playing that way. The type of games that I like, they have probably 3 features, and I'm going to go through what I think those 3 features are. The first one is that they have a nice balance between accessibility and depth, by which I mean it's the kind of game that there's not such a steep learning curve that you spend hours upon hours feeling like you don't even know what the heck you're doing. You can sit down and kind of competently do a few basic things at least right away. I think that's important. But then there has to also be enough depth that there's a reason to come back for man-hour after man-hour after man-hour and keep playing it and keep developing, greater tactical depth. And like I said, I'm not necessarily super good as a player, but at the same time, there are games that you can play for a few hours and you've kind of played them out. There's nothing more to them after that anymore. And then there are games where it takes hours after hours after hours of practice to even be competent. And I really have much less interest in the latter type of thing. This means that there are certain games, for example, that are highly regarded by certain groups within the fandom that I don't particularly care for. In particular, I'm talking about Street Fighter 3 and its various iterations, where I think both Capcom as developers and and the fans of this particular game, many of whom are frankly kind of stupid and toxic, have got themselves into a tunnel vision purity spiral where they are unable to see outside of the technical whatever that they value. I don't think that Street Fighter 3 is a great game for a lot of reasons, but one of them is that it is too precise and too fiddly and requires too much player skill. And I don't want to have to be the equivalent of a professional e-athlete in order to play the game well enough to really, really enjoy myself. I want to be able to, kind of pick it up and play it and enjoy it right away, and yet still have enough depth that I can come back and keep doing that for years to come. I think that Street Fighter 3 is too technical, and it has, like I said, kind of gotten lost in a purity spiral of technical gameplay and tactical, whatever. And I think that the precision required to pull things off is absurd. Now, I'm not talking about pulling off like a Daigo parry. That was a truly remarkable moment that I think most people recognize as remarkable. But even doing a fraction of that, even doing regular parries consistently, for example, is a steep learning curve, and I found the timing of that was always very difficult. And people who really like that kind of stuff, they like it because they like the kind of hardcore tactical precision and player skill and expertise. But there's a reason why Street Fighter 3, all 3 titles combined, sold less than 100,000 units to gamers at home, whereas Street Fighter II sold over 20 million. They lost sight of what made Street Fighter II so great, and they got lost in a purity spiral of technical and skilled play expertise. So Street Fighter 3 is not my type of game. It's too deep. But I do need enough depth that I can keep coming back literally for years and say, oh, I haven't played this character in a long time, or maybe even ever, and so I need to spend quite a bit of time learning how to be reasonably good with it. Not to pull off the moves, not how to pull off the moves, but when to pull off the moves, and what are the tactics and the timing and whatnot that works for this character, and how do you play this character in a way that you consistently win. And like I said, I don't play against other players. Mostly what I do, and this I think is typical for people who aren't professional Street Fighter players and have a day job and a real life, is that they'll sit down and play for a couple hours here and there a few days a week, and that's a different paradigm than the hardcore gamers. And I think that's part of Street Fighter 2's beauty, is that anybody could appreciate it and play it and enjoy it, and yet there was enough depth that you could keep doing it for a long time, and there were reasons to keep coming back to it, so you didn't just play it out and then you were done with it after playing it for a few weeks. So Street Fighter 3 is not my type of game. Another game that's very, very popular, but which is not my type of game, is Marvel vs. Capcom 2. And this, I think, part of that is the gameplay, which I think, with its emphasis on super flashy chain combos and, super spastic hyper movement that makes you feel like you want to take a Ritalin after you've had to watch it for a few minutes, is not something that I enjoy. But really, what even is worse, in my opinion, and this gets into the second point of what I think a good game needs to have, is that the presentation of Marvel vs. Capcom 2 is freaking terrible. And I'm not saying it's not competently done. I'm saying it's just I can't take it seriously, and I don't even think you're supposed to take it seriously. The idea that a little tiny Lego man from Mega Man games, or a gigantic walking, talking cactus with a sombrero would be fighting characters that are relatively straight, if not always serious, like Spider-Man or Iron Man or Captain America, is kind of absurd. And the fact that they're doing it in an environment where they're teaming up with totally random other people and flying in and out in this weird tag team thing with this corny jazz soundtrack in the background, I get really turned off by the presentation of the game, quite honestly. I actually really liked the Marvel games. There were only two of them, Children of the Atom, X-Men Children of the Atom, and Marvel Superheroes. And I really liked them. And rather than the Versus games that we got, and I understand why they made them, and I know that they were popular, so I can't really fault Capcom for making these games, but I wish what they had done is made a sequel to Marvel Superheroes, more in the same style as Marvel Superheroes, using all the characters that the Marvel characters that ended up in Marvel vs. Capcom, which were about twice as many, or maybe even more than twice as many, as there were in Marvel Superheroes. If all of those characters had been playable in a game that had a presentation style more like Marvel Superheroes, where it was played a little bit more straight, I would have loved that game. That would have been one of my favorites in the genre. As it is, though, Marvel versus Capcom is both too silly and too spastic for my taste, and so I never really liked it. And even the follow-ups that were made later, like I have Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 that I got from Steam, for example, and play on my PC. It's got a lot of the same problems, and some people like that. They like the diversity of the characters, the fact that you can have Thor, God of Thunder, fighting against a Japanese attorney wearing a suit, and serving subpoenas is, something that they enjoy, and they think that that's part of the fun. I completely disagree. I think that that's insane and absurd, and I don't appreciate the insanity, I guess. To me, it's just silly for its own sake. So it's got novelty value, but little else. And the fact that the gameplay is so hyper, I know that it's possible to have tactical play in this game, but it always feels to me like this, incredibly spastic button masher is really kind of what you're doing more. And I know that those aren't the players who are really good, but that's kind of just what the feel of the game is like. I just don't appreciate that at all. So I think presentation is important. And by presentation, I don't just mean just the look of the game and the music and all that other jazz, although that is important. And I think that that's something that fighting games sometimes take for granted and don't spend enough attention to. I think part of the secret of Street Fighter II's success is that it had characters that had character and personality. And yeah, sure, they were kind of simplistic. They were kind of caricatures of stereotypes in some ways. But the fact is, you could find something to latch onto with each of these characters. They were all very different from each other. You came back time and time again, in part to play through the game so you could beat Bison and see the story, and then kind of have an even more sense of attachment to the character. Now, I'm not saying that you necessarily need a deep plot to have a successful fighting game, although I do think that having a plot is certainly a major, major plus, and I think that that's also one of Street Fighter's, as a greater franchise, that is one of the secrets to their success that is often overlooked. And it's one of the reasons why some of the other spin-off games that have come out I do not like as much, because they don't even bother trying to include any kind of plot. And they may not even bother trying to have characters that have any character or personality. They're just collections of moves. And there was a developer for the flopped Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, and he kind of made the comment at one point that a character like Magneto, nobody cares about him because he's Magneto, the character known from decades of stories in the comic books and movies and everything else. They care about him because he has a certain tactical type of move list and is a certain type of character from a technical gameplay standpoint. And he could not have been more wrong, quite honestly. And I think that that is something that a lot of developers and even Capcom themselves have often forgotten. I think that was another part of Street Fighter 3's failing, is that nobody freaking cared about any of those characters, and they didn't really have a lot of character. In fact, some of them were deliberately designed not to have character, or that they were, just incredibly generic and boring, or they were just more focused on being a certain tactical move set, and they had to have a graphical representation of those, so that's what the character is. And again, I think this is kind of part of the purity spiral of the Spurgs, who like to play super tactical and complicated technical gameplay, and they lost sight of the fact that that is not all that there is to fighting games, and in fact you can go too far and cross over a line into territory where you're losing people rather than gaining them by adding this kind of tactical depth. So I think that that's an important part of this, is it's got to have good presentation. And there's a lot of things that I mean by presentation, but I mean having characters that are likable, having a reason to relate to them, having a reason to play, having some context that is interesting and makes some sense. There's a lot of emotional kind of connection that you develop with things that you really like. And if you say, no, you don't need any emotional connection, it's just all logic and tactical and technical, then I don't relate to you. You're like some kind of alien being who doesn't think like a human being, and I I don't understand where you're coming from, quite honestly. And I think that was the failing of Street Fighter 3 in particular. But Street Fighter 3 is not alone in that, but I think that was one of its major issues. The third thing that I think is important for a fighting game is that it have a broad roster of characters that are legitimately quite different from each other. And part of this is because different people will gravitate towards different characters. But part of this, too, is that at a certain point, you feel like you've mastered a character as much as you necessarily want to. And that doesn't mean that you won't come back and, play it again later. But it does mean that you're kind of like, if you don't have something different to do in the game, you will quickly lose interest in it. And I think that the best and easiest way to give gamers something different to do in the game is to have a different type of character that plays very differently and has kind of a whole different, approach, so that they can learn that and then spend a lot of time doing that for a while is what brings them back. And, that doesn't mean you have 2 or 3 or even 8. It means the more you have to some degree, the better. Now, there's kind of a limiting factor here where more doesn't necessarily mean better. And there are games that I have, for example, with really broad rosters with lots of characters where I've literally never played some of the characters or only, a tiny bit, and I've certainly never mastered them. Just because I just haven't ever gotten around to them, and that's okay. But I still come back because there are enough characters that I like that are all different from each other, and there are enough reasons to come back that I still really like those games. So I think that is kind of the third and final element of what a really good fighting game needs to have. So given that, I've talked about 2 of the games already, obviously, that have big fan followings, but which I do not like. But hopefully you can understand why I don't like them and why I like the types of games that I do, so that when I talk about the games that I like and I kind of get into this, there's sufficient context that you can understand what I'm talking about. Now, I don't say this stuff to you to invite you to argue with me, because I don't care what you think. I don't care what you like or why you like it, really. I'm not that I don't care. I think it's interesting to talk about. But I'm not doing this to invite you to argue with me and tell me that I'm wrong, because I'm not. This is what I like, and I like it, and I'm not going to change just because somebody passionately tries to hammer into me what they like and why they like it. Sorry, I don't care in that way, and you're absolutely never going to change my mind, and in fact, you're probably going to piss me off if you try to do that. So I know nobody even knows about my channel. Nobody knows who I am. Nobody will find this, or nobody will do that. But I'm just giving it heads up right now. I'm an opinionated person. I am not going to change my mind because of what you think. That doesn't mean that I don't like to necessarily talk to you about it and find out what you like and why you like it. I think that's interesting, as long as it doesn't have to be something where you're preaching to me about what I should like and why I should like it. Sorry, no, I don't. I like what I like, and this is why. So hopefully as I go through the games, as I do this series, that context will kind of help put all that in perspective. Anyway, we'll get to those later. I have now arrived at my destination, and I enjoy this recording while driving. There's probably a little bit of background noise, I'm sure, but that's okay. It's worth it because it keeps me on track and I don't ramble enough. We'll talk to you later.